Our hope is that the discussion this evening will help enlighten the discussion of the relationship between religious faith and public policy in the American political landscape. Here to welcome those who will take part in this discussion is the one who is in his 10th year as the 25th president of Boston College, Father William P. Leahy of the Society of Jesus.
I too would like to welcome you to this event, all of you here in Conti Forum, and also I want to extend greetings to those participating via the web and C-SPAN. I'm grateful that all of you could come and be in Conti Forum tonight. This evening is sponsored by Boston College's Church in the 21st Century initiative, which was launched in May 2002 amid the clerical sexual abuse scandal, and it was an initiative to help the Catholic community in America move from crisis to renewal. C21 began with a focus on three critical issues: the roles and relationships of laymen and women, priests and bishops, and how to enhance them; sexuality in Catholic teaching and in contemporary culture; and third, the challenge of living and handing on the Catholic faith to succeeding generations. Last year, a fourth focus was added to encourage reflection on the Catholic intellectual tradition. C21 has exceeded our expectations. In the past 3.5 years, 35,000 people have come to campus to hundreds of events. Another 70,000 have visited the C21 website. 160,000 people received C21 Resources, which is a collection of selected articles about a particular topic, and that C21 Resources is published twice a year. In addition, a book series has been started with the first volume dealing with organizational ethics in the Church appearing this past fall. And 6 more books on a range of topics will be published in the next 18 months. Last summer, C21 was made a permanent center at Boston College, reflecting the university's recognition that work still needs to be done, and also that Boston College intends to continue its efforts over the long term to help revitalize the Catholic Church and Catholic life in the United States. I remain convinced that much of the renewal of the Church in the United States will come from what happens on the campuses of Catholic colleges and universities like Boston College. Tonight's event brings together a distinguished panel to discuss issues concerning how the faith of Catholic politicians can and should affect public policy, as well as the relationship between those politicians and the Church. We are fortunate to have Tim Russert, a great friend of Boston College. Along with Tim and his wife Maureen, they are the parents of a Boston College sophomore. And Tim is a person who is commonly regarded as the most influential journalist in Washington. He will be the moderator of our discussion, and don't let him dissuade you from that. I am grateful to Tim and the members of our panel for being with us tonight and for sharing their views. It is unlikely, though distinguished that all of them are, that they will resolve all of the complexities surrounding Catholic politicians, their faith, and public policy. But I have no doubt that we could not gather a more expert group to shed light on the issues and challenges concerning our topic for this evening. So please join me in welcoming Tim Russert and our panelists to Boston College tonight.
Good evening, and Father Leahy, thank you very much. This was Father's idea. We discussed it at a football game this fall, and look at this turnout. People care very, very deeply about this subject. First, I want to express my deep appreciation to several faculty members here at Boston College, Father Bob Imbelli, Father Michael Himes, Father John Parrish, Father Jim Keenan, and a former Boston College man, now at Georgetown, Father Robert Drinan, all of whom I've talked to over the last few weeks and solicited their input as to areas of exploration for tonight. I also want to welcome someone very special in my own tutoring through life. My 7th grade teacher is here tonight, Sister Mary Lucille. Now, the reason she's so important, it was Sister Lucille who summoned me to the front of the room with one of these and said, "Timothy, we need to find an alternative vehicle to channel your excessive energy." She made me the editor of the school newspaper in 7th grade and changed my life. And because of my work on that newspaper, I was admitted to Canisius High School, the Jesuit high school in Buffalo, where I encountered Father John Sturm, the prefect of discipline, who threw me against the lockers the second day there. And I said, "Father, please, I'm new here. Don't you have any mercy?" He said, "Russert, mercy's for God. I deliver justice." And so my journey began. And just to reassure you about this whole notion of discussing this complicated subject on this campus, remember, we are in the Silvio Conti Forum next to the Thomas O'Neill Library. Let's meet our panel in alphabetical order. He is a man who attended Louisiana State University. He helped elect Bill Clinton to the presidency in 1992. He's a political commentator for CNN. He has a new book called Take It Back, Our Party, Our Country, Our Future, James Carville. Continuing with the D's, Mr. E.J. Dionne. He attended a college in Boston across the river, Harvard. An extraordinary reporter for the New York Times. When he worked there, he covered the Vatican. When I first met him, when I brought the Today Show there some 25 years ago, now writes for the Washington Post, a must-read column in Washington and around the country. He is now associated also with the liberal think tank, the Brookings Institution, and his book is a classic, Why Americans Hate Politics, one of several he's written, E.J. Dionne. Next, Ed Gillespie. And Ed told me he finally got into BC. That he was waitlisted 30 years ago, and here he is, God bless him. A graduate of Catholic University. Ed, you know well from his tenure as chairman of the Republican Party, a time when he elected both a Republican president and retained House control of both houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. He is also the founder and chairman of the Quinn Gillespie Associates, a bipartisan public affairs and strategy firm. He was someone deeply involved in the drafting of the Contract with America in 1994. He has a new book coming out in September, How Conservatives Win and Why We Must, Ed Gillespie. And lastly but not least, a best-selling author. She has 5 books on American politics, history, and culture. The most recent, John Paul the Great, Remembering a Spiritual Father. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It captures the essence of John Paul II. She is a contributing editor to Wall Street Journal and a weekly columnist for the Journal's editorial page. She gave service to our country and was honored by working for 2 American presidents, Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush, a graduate of Fairleigh Dickinson University, Peggy Noonan. All right, Mr. Carville, we'll go alphabetical order. Let's start with you with a nice, easy one.
Sure.
Can you be a good Democrat and a good Catholic?
Well, I think let's get to the meat of the coconut here. What we're really talking about is abortion, because that's the mother lode issue. The position of the church, as I understand it, is that abortion shall be illegal in all cases with the exception of the life of the mother. There may be 10% of the Catholics in the United States agree with that. In fact, the majority of Catholics believe that abortion should be legal in almost all circumstances. So apparently, well over half of the faithful believe that you can be a good Catholic and have a different position on abortion. I don't know. It's a tortured issue, but it's not up to me. I mean, each Catholic has to decide where he or she fits into it. And certainly, if you went through the entire teachings of the church, I'd say that the teachings of the church more line up with the Democratic Party than they do in the Republican Party. And I don't know many Republicans. This president, Tim, is for 7 constitutional amendments, which is the most of any human being that ever lived in America. And he's not even for banning abortion with only the exception of the life of the mother. So I don't know where it is, but that is the issue. When people talk about it, we're going to go right to what it is. We should talk about the abortion issue because that's first and foremost of what this is about. And I think that it speaks eloquently that you have different opinions in the church. Like I say, well over half of the Catholics in the United States believe abortion should be legal in almost all circumstances. I would say 90% of the Catholics in the church disagree with the statement that abortion should only be legal when the life of the mother is threatened. And certainly a clear, huge majority, something like 77% on physical health, 75% on rape and incest. So I think every day Catholics prove that you can be a good Catholic, a good Democrat, and have a different position in the church on abortion.
Ed Gillespie, can you be a good Republican and a good Catholic on all the issues of concern to the church?
Yeah, I believe you can. I'm reminded of an old Irish joke that had Mrs. O'Malley and Mrs. O'Reilly at the butcher shop one Monday afternoon, and they started gossiping, and Mr. O'Reilly said, "Did you hear about Patrick Donahue? He became a Republican." Mrs. O'Malley said, "'Tain't true. I just saw him in Mass yesterday." There was a time when the thinking was if you were Irish and Catholic and you were in the pew on Sunday, you were voting Democrat on Tuesday. That is not the case anymore at all. In fact, we haven't seen a president elected with the majority of the population without carrying a majority of the Catholic vote, going all the way back to when John F. Kennedy got 83% of the Catholic vote in 1960. But I think John Kerry showed, regardless of the question of whether you can embrace some of these tenets relative to abortion on demand or federal funding of abortion or support for partial birth abortion or euthanasia or any other of these issues, same-sex marriage, whether that you can be a good Catholic and embrace those things is a theological question. I think it's hard to be a good candidate and be a Catholic and support those things, and I think that's what we saw with John Kerry in November when he became the first Catholic to not carry the Catholic vote in a presidential election.
E.J. Dionne, continuing in alphabetical order, can you be a good liberal and a good Catholic?
I think it's essential. First of all, I want to say Tim left one thing out of my biography, which is that I grew up in Fall River, Massachusetts, and that almost anything intelligent I say tonight, if I do say anything intelligent tonight, I learned in Fall River. And I want to salute my sister who's in the audience, and just because I want to steal his aura, Father Brian Hare is over there, and it's great to see some old friends. Also, it's good to be in a place where they root for the right teams, the Red Sox and the Patriots. The first Patriots game I saw, the Patriots beat the Buffalo Bills at Fenway Park. It was wonderful. Now I'm in for it the whole night.
You believe in miracles.
My version of Ed's story, imagine if he had gone to BC, all that talent could have been devoted to the right side. It's a shame. Mrs. O'Reilly being taken to the polls by her son, her son is now upper middle class, or didn't go to BC like Ed didn't, and starts voting for a lot of Republicans. So the son sort of asked the mother, Mom, how are you going to vote? And as always, she said straight Democratic, and the son is very annoyed and says, Mom, if Jesus came back to earth and ran as a Republican, you would vote against him. And Mrs. O'Reilly said, oh, hush, why should he change his party after all these years? And I think we're having a lot of these discussions because there seem to be a number of people under the impression that Jesus has changed his party after all these years. I'm a very old-fashioned Catholic. I think the church's job in politics is to make all of us feel guilty about something. And that I think that Republicans ought to be made to feel guilty about a kind of, sort of sink or swim economic policy and whether they're doing enough for the poor. And yes, I think liberals ought to be made to feel guilty and think twice or 3 times or 4 times about all of the life issues. And I think one of the troublesome things in the last election for a lot of Catholics of my sort is that the church did not seem to be an equal opportunity guilt producer. That it seemed to say that the abortion issue takes priority over all other questions, including questions of social justice, including questions of war and peace, including the death penalty. If you look at where the church stands on most issues, to directly answer Tim's question, the church's view on community, on lifting up the poor, on health care, and on issue after issue, and the death penalty, where a lot of liberals and Democrats have gone south over the years, the positions of the church are broadly liberal. And that I think that the church is not an ideological place, and at its best, again, it calls us all back from narrow ideological politics. But I think it's quite congenial to be a Catholic and to be a liberal.
Peggy Noonan, can you be a good conservative and a good Catholic?
Yes, I think it is quite congenial and in some ways almost inevitable. If one is a Catholic, that one will at least wind up being a conservative. In my time, and in EJ's time, in the time of this entire generation, these woebegone boomers who are represented up here, in our time we have seen people who were Democrats, who were born Democrats, who came from the great cities, certainly of the East, New York, Brooklyn, which in my Brooklyn childhood we considered to be a separate place, Philadelphia, Boston, God bless it. The voters in those cities in the year 1900, in the year 1950, so many of them, they were Democrats. They were proud members of the Democratic Party. They were American ethnics. They were Irish and Polish and Italian. They were the bedrock of the Democratic Party, and certainly they represented what the Democratic Party was when I was a kid and when Jack Kennedy was running for president. I don't think the current Democratic Party is really so happy with what has happened to it in the past 30 and 40 years, because it lost the kind of people I am describing, the city people, the ethnics, the people born Democratic. How did they lose them? I think they lost them in the 1970s, and I think they lost them over many of the social issues that we are referencing tonight. I remember when the Democratic Party was a dominant party in so many ways, and now it is not. I think the Republicans benefited very greatly from the switch in which the Democratic Party seemed to almost have some kind of odd leftism imposed on it in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and the Republicans were apart from that and took advantage of the fact that wasn't happening to them. I think you can be, however, bottom line, you can attempt to be a faithful Catholic and a good Catholic and a worshiping Catholic and a thoughtful Catholic and wind up politically in a number of places and in a number of parties, and I think we should always keep that in mind. Maybe in part to be Catholic is to be curious and to look for large belief. And half the people I know are who are Catholic are Democrats. About another half are Republicans. That probably reflects roughly how it is in the United States. I'm not sure it's easy to be a Catholic and a Democrat or a Catholic and a Republican, just because it's hard in general to be a Catholic, but I think it's worth the struggle. I'll leave it there.
James Carville, let me just offer these statistics and I'll open it up for everyone. When you study American politics and behavior, particularly with religious groups, ethnic groups, race groups, there was a pretty easy way to determine if someone was a Democrat or Republican. And that has all changed. The primary indicator now that determines how you're going to vote, particularly for president, is church attendance. And let me just read this from the last presidential election. 2004. Voters who attend church more than once a week, which is 16% of the electorate, voted for George Bush 64-35 over John Kerry. Voters who attended house of worship once a week, which is 26% of Americans, voted for Bush 58-41. Those who attended monthly split 50-50, and that's 14% of the electorate. The 28% of the voters who attend church a few times a year voted for Kerry 54-45, and those who never attended worship services voted for Kerry 62-36. What does that tell you about the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and the issue of faith in people's lives?
First of all, I did, thanks to Becky, all of the places that I talked about religion in my book are marked here, and they're extensive. And I think it says that the Democrats have a lot of opportunity to talk to people who go to church better, and we obviously need to do better than that. I mean, look, purpose of a political party is to win elections, and we haven't been doing that. We've been coming close, but as we know, that counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. Doesn't count in politics. I think that Democrats should talk about religious tradition and faith. And I think that, and if you think about it, there really is but one teaching. 3,000 times in the Gospels, Jesus talked about how we should treat the poor. He said that there was one commandment, there were two commandments, to love your God and love your neighbor as yourself, and everything else was commentary. He was so concerned about the issue of homosexuality that he uttered not a single word on it. Not a single word. So, what I hope that a Democrat says is, I am very, very schooled in religious traditions, and I want people of all faiths to understand what their tradition is. For my friends of the Jewish faith, the first question recorded in the Bible is Cain asking God, am I my brother's keeper? And we decidedly know that God told him that you are. And that what we have seen, and when people come to work in my administration, the question I want to know is not what church they go to, how often they go, whether they go to a church or a synagogue, but do they understand the fundamental teaching of what religion has taught us? And I'm more concerned with that than I am how publicly pious they are, or how many times they go to mass, or church, or the mosque, or the synagogue. And I think if you ask people, when you think of what is a Christian value, they will inevitably tell you it's how we treat each other. And I would say that time and time and time again, that the Democrats have had a unbelievably superior record on that. So we should not run away from religious teachings. We should run to them. And we should not condemn those that don't see it this way. We should bring them in. We should talk about it. But we shouldn't run away from this. There's nothing. We are a country that is shaped. You can't live in this country and not be shaped at some point. But what's happened is that religion and politics, we've gotten away from what religion teaches. We've gotten away from 3,000 times. Jesus told us it's about how we treat the poor. And we look, every time we turn around, it's some other way we're giving people a short end of the stick. So I do think that we need to do better. I think there's great opportunity here. I wrote about it extensively, and I think we should not walk away, but be glad to talk about how faith shapes us and shapes our values and shapes the way we look at things.
Ed Gillespie, reflect on those poll numbers that I talked about, the exit polls of voters, and also the perception that Democrats would acknowledge after 2004 that despite a lot of issues that were going against the president, the issue of values somehow benefits Republicans. Why is that? And be counterintuitive. Give the Democrats some advice as to what they should be doing in order to be able to debate these kinds of issues that James just did.
Well, you know, Tim, it's interesting. Peggy was talking about the migration of these ethnic Catholics, Reagan Democrats at one point, really, that became, over time, Reagan Republicans today, Bush Republicans. And I lived that myself. I personify it to a certain extent. I was born in New Jersey, son of an Irish immigrant in 1961, the year John F. Kennedy was sworn in as the first Catholic president in our country's history, and they all but stamped Democrat on my birth certificate. The first person I went to work for in politics was a Southern conservative Democrat, a Reagan Democrat. He changed parties in 1984, and I changed with him, like so many ethnic Catholic Democrats did at that time. And one of the reasons I think that so many did is because there was a sense that there was a greater tolerance of a point of view when it came to issues of faith in the Republican Party than there were in the Democratic Party. That's not to say that Democrats are not people of faith. Not all Democrats are not people of faith, and not all Republicans are people of faith. But I think there was a sense of greater comfort that if you believe strongly in the right to life, if you believe strongly that marriage is the union between one man and one woman, that is a more welcome view in the Republican Party. And Joseph Bottom in the Weekly Standard, the writer, had an interesting line in one of the January issues. He said that Catholics are welcome in the Democratic Party, just not their Catholicism. And I think that what you find is that there is a greater tolerance of this point of view. And as I listen to James, one of the things I think back to of 2004, Tim, and other elections, is I think that we have as a party, the Republican Party, have been guilty in the past of being when it comes to some of these issues, of being coming across as intolerant of those who don't agree. And so if people didn't agree with our position on life, we were perceived as being intolerant of that viewpoint. Or if people didn't agree on same-sex marriage, we were perceived as intolerant. I would suggest to you today that most Americans in the middle would say that it is the liberal side and the Democratic side that is less tolerant of an opposing point of view when it comes to these issues than are those who are on the pro-life and pro-marriage side.
But let me just ask you a question. Yeah. Do you believe someone who was pro-abortion rights could ever be nominated for president on the Republican ticket?
I think they could. I think it would be hard. It would be hard in the party today. I do know this. Someone who is pro-abortion rights is allowed to speak at the Republican convention. You can't find anyone who is pro-life allowed to speak at the Democratic convention. So there, again, in terms of the tolerance, whether or not they get the nomination, they're certainly free to speak.
Yeah, E.J., Deanna, let me pick up on this, because now we're getting into the crux of things here. Cardinal Ratzinger, when he was now our Pope, when he was Cardinal, he had written the American bishops, and the worthiness to receive Holy Communion was the title. And he writes in there, not all moral issues have the same moral weight as abortion and euthanasia. For example, if a Catholic were to be at odds with the Holy Father on the application of capital punishment or on the decision to wage war, he would not for that reason be considered unworthy to present himself to receive Holy Communion. While the Church exhorts civil authorities to seek peace, not war, and to exercise discretion and mercy in imposing punishment on criminals, it may still be permissible to take up arms, repel an aggressor, to have recourse to capital punishment. There may be a legitimate diversity of opinion even among Catholics about waging war and applying the death penalty, but not, however, with regard to abortion and euthanasia. How does a Catholic politician deal with that?
Well, I think on the abortion question, the challenge I want to throw out to my Right to Life friends, whom I have a lot of sympathy for, is to ask the question, how can you best protect life? And how can we reduce the number of abortions in the United States? I think everyone in this room, if they're honest with themselves, knows that if Roe v. Wade fell tomorrow, which would actually make the Republicans very unhappy because it would change the politics very substantially, that if Roe v. Wade fell tomorrow, most of the largest states in the Union would keep abortion legal. If abortion were ever made illegal across the country, there would still be an enormous number of illegal abortions, especially after this long period of having abortion legal. But it's very unlikely abortion will ever be illegal in the United States. On the other hand, we do know that we can reduce the number of abortions. The abortion rate fell 11% under that great conservative moral majority president Bill Clinton, and it fell 11% because economic circumstances changed and because a lot of good things were happening for poor people. And so I think that on this question, the church is very big on the word prudential. Let us try to think prudentially about what's the best way to protect life. And I think the best way to protect life would, on the one hand, and I know you can't say this in a Catholic college, but I do think contraception and abstinence teaching early on, some combination of the two, and helping mothers who want to bring their kids into the world, bring their kids into the world. Senator Bob Kerrey gave this very powerful talk a couple of years ago where he said, imagine a woman who is working in a factory where she has a decent income and she has health coverage. And imagine she gets pregnant. And imagine that she loses her job, doesn't know where her income is going to come from, doesn't know where she's going to get the health care to support her pregnancy and the child inside her. Under which circumstances is she more likely to choose life? Isn't she going to choose life if she has economic opportunity and health coverage? And I think if we're going to talk about the right to life, this is the way we have to begin to talk about it, because I think we will save more lives.
Let me just ask EJ just a follow-up on that. Do you believe that Democratic Catholic politicians envision the relation of religious faith and common good differently than the Catholic hierarchy?
No, I think there's a lot in common. I actually have a column coming out tomorrow. 55 Democratic members of the House have signed a letter, an expression of their belief, their religious belief. And it's actually, unusually for a political document, it's only 8 paragraphs. It's a very concise but very clear statement of their connection with the church's tradition in thinking about the common good. I once debated Ralph Reed, and one of the things I do think liberals have done wrong for a number of years is they spent too much time saying religious people somehow don't belong in the political arena, which is kind of odd if you grew up as a Catholic in Massachusetts. And they sort of were reacting so much against the religious right that they reacted too much against the word religious and not enough against the word right. And so when I debated Ralph Reed, I said, look, I will defend always your right to bring your religious faith to the public square, but you must explain to me where Jesus says that we must cut the capital gains tax. And I think that the democratic conception of the common good, particularly a lot of Catholic Democrats, is very consonant with the church. The bishop's 1919 program of social reconstruction basically laid the basis for the New Deal. Peggy mentioned that somehow the left had come into the Democratic Party. There was that character called St. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whom I don't recall was a conservative. So that I think there was this link between Catholic social teaching and the Democratic Party. Democrats have been reluctant to talk about it. I think that's a mistake. I think they learned a lot about God on election night in 2004, and many of them seem to be coming to God since then.
Peggy Noonan, in preparing for this evening, I went back and read so many things. Some work written by John Courtney Murray, who was a theologian during Vatican II particularly, obviously. And he summed it this way: it is not the function of civil law to prescribe everything that is morally right, or to forbid everything that is morally wrong. Is that something that Catholic politicians could feel comfortable with and use as a way of saying, I am opposed to abortion personally. I will do all I can to encourage abstinence and to prevent abortion, but I will still vote to maintain a right for people who have a different view?
In a way here tonight, we're talking about communicating, strategizing, getting around issues. You know, you ask James, gee, how come people who aren't people who go to church a few times a month, how come they don't feel comfortable in the Catholic Church? And he says, well, the Catholics ought to talk more about religion. What is it that you want to say about religion? Do you know what I mean? In a way, it's not a communications problem, it's just a real big problem. Look, do I think Catholic politicians, Catholic Democrats, or however you put it, can think however they like and speak however they like and do their best wherever they stand on abortion? To my mind, it just comes down to some really real things. Since abortion has been legal in the United States, we've had roughly 40 million abortions. That's presumably 40 million people who'd be here if they hadn't been aborted. That's a heck of a lot of people. That's something that's real. When you come right down to saying, you know, I personally am against abortion, but I will defend to the death your right to be for it. In a way, I understand what you're saying, but to me, in a way, that sounds like I am against, you know, this is 1860, I am against slavery, but I will defend to the death your right to be for slavery. You know, I suppose logically you can say that's okay. It's just not to me. EJ says, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little hot under the collar here because this is all too abstract and airy for me, and I'm just going to get more down to it. EJ says one of the greatest ways to cut down on abortions is through economic programs that you think will be helpful to young girls who are pregnant. That's fine with me. But another way that is attendant to that and arguably more helpful than that is to talk about abortion, talk about why it is not good, why it is the taking of a human life, why we don't want it to be legally protected in the United States. Those things are important too. This isn't just an issue you can get around and dance around. You know, it's real. The Catholic Church is against abortion for real and serious reasons, and we should all address it in a real and serious way. It's not just a dance.
It's so real that we ought to...
Now, you're going to do a debating point now, but how do you really?
No, but it's so real that we ought to do real things to reduce the number of abortions.
Okay,
that's
how about
exactly
talking
what
about
I'm
it and saying,
about.
whoa, maybe abortion isn't so great.
I think that's a great idea.
It's not just all startup Planned Parenthood thing.
No, it's definitely not all that. It's about values. It's about taking motherhood and fatherhood seriously. But it is also about creating the circumstances in which a woman who is pregnant can bring the child into the world with some hope that she and that child can live a decent life. If that's not real, I don't know what is.
Everybody wants that, but you can't say, look, life has to be perfect. Life isn't going to be perfect. Life is imperfect on the beginning of it and at the end of it. Abortion is either okay or it's not. It's either something we want to discuss and say, whoa, you want to hold off on that or not. Again, it's not just...
I'm not talking about perfect. I'm talking about a job and a little bit of health care. I don't think that's perfection.
Well, if you want to get to a job in health care, then you have to debate what's the best way to go about those things and get them. I don't think you can just assume liberals good, conservatives bad. You might say, hey, we want the economy to be pumping out jobs. What are the conditions that we need to get the economy to pump out jobs? That has implications for tax policy, spending policy, regulating policy. Do you know what I mean? The answer is not just, well, be a liberal, everything will be better.
Look,
all right.
I gotta respond to something here. And I really do. Let me say this. If there's a 32-year-old single mother with 2 kids who is pregnant, and she knows the baby's going to have a Down syndrome, and she knows that her boss will fire, and her husband will beat her up, and she chooses to have an abortion, she is not the equivalent of a slave owner. Okay, I just want to say that right now. That is not the equivalent of slavery. And you know that they are, and I know, and I'm a moral relativist. I think there's a difference between an abortion at 8 weeks and 8 months. Okay? You can say what I want. And I think these are difficult decisions that people make. I don't think it's like the greatest thing in the world, but they're not slave owners. These are people that many times are faced with very unfortunate circumstances. And somehow or another, everybody gets on a thing and it says, this is the way that you got to do it. You know, sometimes the problem with being a Democrat is you're just a Democrat. And you know what? I don't think gays are a threat to my marriage. I really don't. I can't really say it with much conviction. I don't think the whole country is falling apart because of gay people. You know, I really don't. And I don't believe that some of these women are in really difficult circumstances, and I'm all for if you ought to talk to them and counseling and anything else, but I don't believe that they're slave owners. I'm not for, when it comes to immigration, if somebody's been in this country 7, 8 years and been working and got kids in the school, I'm not sending them back to Bolivia tomorrow. I'm sorry, I'm just not going to do it. I'm just a Democrat. And I think that Democrats ought to just come out and say that. But this one thing for the Pope to sit there and say, anybody that doesn't say this is illegal in every instance except for the life of the mother can't receive Holy Communion. If there's somebody that needs communion, it is a woman that's faced with these kind of choices and the people around her. And everybody could, you know, we could have a little understanding here. Everybody could have a little understanding because a lot of times these are really hard, difficult things that people are faced with. There's the world that these guys in the Vatican live in, and there's a world that these people are living in around the world, and sometimes it's not the same world.
Tim, can I please add you in? Thanks. I think this illustrates a couple of points. First of all, I don't want to speak for Peggy, but I think I will share the sentiment. I don't think anyone is condemning a pregnant mother, a single pregnant mother, and the challenges that she faces, and no one is saying that that person is a slave owner. The fact is that no one is condemning, by the way, gay people. I am, you know, one of the things I think is most important about my faith is the fact that it is one of rooted in forgiveness and reconciliation, and one where we accept one another for who we are. And I accept and have people very close to me who are gay, and I love them. That doesn't mean I have to abandon the tenets of my faith and impose the government sanction of same-sex marriage and support that. I believe that loving that person and accepting that person for who he or she is the definition of tolerance. I don't believe that my support for a ban on government sanction of same-sex marriage makes me a bigot, as I've been called by people who think that the government should sanction same-sex marriage. And I don't think, by the way, that abortion is the only thing that differentiates the Catholic vote in this country. I, in fact, think that's a misperception, and we're perpetuating it here this evening. There are a lot of other issues. One of the things that brought me into the Republican Party from the Democratic Party, frankly, was Ronald Reagan's strong stand against communism, which resonated very strongly with a lot of Catholics. When I grew up in St. Anne's Parish in the Pines of New Jersey, the Pine Barrens, every once in a while, and I think it was about once a month, the parish priest would ask us to pray for those Catholics trapped behind the Iron Curtain. There was a very strong concern, and that's why you saw so many Polish Catholics and Lithuanian Catholics and Latvian Catholics and Russian Catholics support Ronald Reagan in areas like Chicago and Philadelphia and New York and Milwaukee. So I think we should accept the fact that it's not only abortion. Abortion, no doubt, matters, and it is more resonant with Catholic voters than it is with other voters. They are disproportionately higher in support of a pro-life position than they are other voters, but not a majority support a pro-life position. And I think to acknowledge the fact that there is bigger shifts that have taken place that have led to this migration, and it has been a migration. It is still a swing vote, but the fact is we have gone from a point where 83% of Catholics voted for the Democrat in 1960 to 52% voting for the Republican in 2004, and it's been a fairly steady stream toward the Republican Party over those 46 years, and it is not only because of abortion.
Ed, but if you broaden that out, abortion, stem cell,
euthanasia,
but on the other side, the war in Iraq, the death penalty,
social justice,
yeah. the church outspoken on those issues, contrary to certainly President Bush's position.
I agree with you. I think those are important issues as well. And I think that, in fact, if you look at welfare reform, I think one of the most significant and one of the most successful public policy efforts of the past 20 years, passed with a Democratic president and a Republican Congress, welfare reform took on a much more rational approach, I think, as a result of a very strong Catholic influence over the debate. When we stopped talking about saving money and started talking about saving families, and we stopped talking about saving money, started talking about saving lives, and we embraced, frankly, John Paul the Great's encyclical on labor and work, and talked about the dignity of work, that's when we were able to get something done in a common sense consensus manner in welfare that saved families and has resulted, I think, in a very positive impact in our country. I think the same is true on issues of social justice. There's a reason George W. Bush ran as a compassionate conservative in 2000 and 2004 to acknowledge the need to meet those less fortunate. Now, we'll probably never do as much as obviously a lot of Democrats want us to do, but the fact is that acknowledgement is there, and I think it should be. And I think the Catholic Church has had a very important, Catholic voters have had a very positive and dramatic impact on the public debate in terms of just war, in terms of social justice, in terms of tolerance, and in terms of right to life and culture of life issues as well.
E.J. Dionne, when does a political compromise become an ethical compromise? Where you're a Catholic politician, a Democrat, a liberal, wrestling with these issues we're talking about tonight, accused by some of being a cafeteria Catholic, picking and choosing what subjects and issues you want to agree with the official church teaching on, and wrestling with those and trying to apply them to a pluralistic society, trying to find the common good. When does a moral compromise, political compromise, when do they conflict?
I just want to applaud Ed for talking about unions in Poland. I've always found it fascinating that Republicans always loved unions in Poland a whole lot more than they loved unions in the United States. I don't know why that might be, but bless you for that, Ed.
I'm mentioning unions in Poland, but I'm for them.
And can I make two quick points, and I want to try to answer that very difficult question. Point number one, let's be honest about what the Catholic vote is. There is no Catholic vote, and it's important. By which I mean that Catholics right now are divided roughly 40-40-20. About 40% of us, for some of the reasons Ed said, also because Catholics have gotten fairly affluent, and because the Catholic vote was never as democratic as it looked in the Kennedy election. That was an exceptional election. There were 40% solidly Republican, 40% solidly Democratic, and so the fight is for the 20. Now, that 20% in the middle happens to be really important because there are a lot of Catholics, and they live in rather important places in large numbers, such as Ohio. So we're not talking about a uniform view, and my hunch is that we're going to be fighting for this Catholic vote for a long time. It's not a steady sort of line from Kennedy to Bush in this last election. Bill Clinton won the Catholic vote by, I think, 9 points back in 1996, so there was a kind of restoration of Democratic strength. The problem with trying to talk about political compromise is it depends on what you are compromising. Reinhold Niebuhr, my favorite theologian, once said that original sin is the only empirically verifiable doctrine of the Christian church, by which he meant that we know, looking at human beings, that we are flawed instruments, and that in some sense the job of politics is to bring love to bear on the problems of a sinful world. On an issue such as abortion, or gay marriage, let's take those two. What is a compromise exactly on abortion? What if Roe v. Wade fell? I think it would be very difficult to outlaw abortion in the first trimester, in the first 8 to 13 weeks of pregnancy. I think there are a lot of Americans, it doesn't work with the interest groups or with people who feel passionately about this because it's either a yes or a no, and those are morally consistent positions, and I respect them. Most people are very uneasy with abortion the later it goes in the cycle, unless the abortion is designed to protect a mother's life. Is that an acceptable compromise? A lot of Catholic countries in Europe have come up with that compromise. And then on gay marriage, I just want to tell a story, which is I always thought the Massachusetts court acted precipitously and that, they handed the Republicans a good issue in the 2004 election. And one day I wanted to write a column about the issue of gay rights and gay marriage. And I have a cousin, a dear cousin who's gay, who was very close to my mother, and my mother was his godmother. And my mother was the first supporter of gay rights that I knew because she always thought she was standing up for the cousin. And I called him up and I said I wanted to write about this relationship he and my mother had, and he was fine with that and didn't realize how much it influenced my mother's view on this question. And my mother was a very serious Catholic. And he told me in this conversation that because of this court decision in Massachusetts, he had married his partner of 31 years. And I said to him, my God, you've been a lot more faithful to each other than awful lot of the people who are opposing gay marriage and who are in your face. And it sort of struck me, is this a moral evil? Can I see the fact that this cousin of mine had an opportunity to declare commitment to this partner of his of 31 years? Is this a moral evil? I found it very hard to see that. That's different from imposing it on churches. The government cannot enforce a church to sanction a gay relationship. But I must say that it forced me to rethink a lot of things about this, because when I hung up that phone, I was happy for my cousin. I did not think that was a moral evil.
Tim, can I? Please. I think EJ touches on something else that's very much at play in our body politic today. When you mentioned this, the Massachusetts court acted precipitously in sanctioning same-sex marriage or government sanction of same-sex marriage. You talk about Roe v. Wade, and if it fell tomorrow, and the debate that would take place across the land in states and legislatures and on referenda, and this difficult issue would be worked through by the voters, by the American people, and the same with same-sex marriage. There are legitimate points of view on both sides of all of these very sensitive issues. One of the things I was most proud of the president when he came out in favor of an amendment, he said, we have to approach this debate with civility and goodwill toward one another and tolerance. But one of the things that we have going on in our body politic today is the fact that the courts tend to impose these things on the body politic rather than allowing the voters to work through them and have a sense that we've come to some sense in our society and some balance. Instead, you have 9 unelected people in robes saying, here's what it's going to be, live with it. And that's why you have so many hard feelings, I think, and why these issues have become so polarizing, rather than allowing the voters to work through them with legitimate goodwill and discussion to work these things out. And I think that's one of the reasons, obviously, these Supreme Court fights have become so important in the culture today.
I think, just by the way, that Roe was one of the worst things that ever happened to liberalism, because at the time Roe v. Wade came down, the country was actually working its way through this question. Peggy's old boss, Ronald Reagan, signed one of the most liberal abortion laws of the country in California in 1970. I think we would have been better off as a country, and I think liberals would be better off today if we continue to work this through the democratic process. So I think,
we're in agreement.
that, as a liberal, I know that Ruth Bader Ginsburg also holds this view. I think it's unfortunate to decide a lot of these questions through the courts. I think that's true of physician-assisted suicide as well.
Let me, Peggy, bring you in here on this whole issue of, in the public square, in the public arena, Catholic politicians, and this notion of lesser of evils. Jim Keenan, who's on the faculty here, has written passionately in a paper that was actually printed in a Vatican newspaper about the lesser evil of allowing a husband in Africa to wear a condom so as to not infect his wife with AIDS. And applying that same sense of lesser evils. A Catholic politician in the United States saying there is no way outlawing all abortions is enforceable in the United States, but instead we should try to limit them by parental consent or counseling, or we should try to, in terms of education programs. It's a lesser of evils, and we can take positive steps to that, and I'm fulfilling my obligation as a public servant in a pluralistic society, and also, in my own mind, a Catholic politician says, dealing with my conscience as a Catholic?
I'm not sure why that's called lesser evil. I mean, if you have grave qualms about abortion and whether or not it should be legally protected, there are probably two things that you want. The first is, how do we start to limit the number of abortions? I mean, that's just common sense. The fewer you have, the more people who continue to live. Good. The second thing is, do we want this to be legal? That's number two. Number one is, how can we help cut down? All of the ways to cut down on abortion are fine with me. I don't see them as lesser evils. I think of them as practical and good. But I think it is also important that you look at the basic reason why you want to have fewer abortions, and that's because as a society you don't feel good about it. You are not easy about it. You are uneasy and unhappy, and don't think it should be legally protected. In fact, you think E.J. loves to talk eloquently about the Democratic Party and to suggest it is the party of the little guy. You know, there's no guy who is littler than someone who might be aborted tomorrow. Do you know what I mean? A fetus is pretty much a little guy. That's about as little as you can get. So, I would also like to note, irrelevantly, but where there's a lot of autobiography been going on up here, I used to work at WEEI in Boston, where I was a news writer on the overnight shift. And as a news writer on the overnight shift, and a person who was in transit, this is about 25 years ago, from a liberal Democrat to conservative Republican, a transit helped along very much by my experience in Boston, where I witnessed firsthand busing and what happens when judges in black robes make decisions that you think are harmful to people. But while I was at EEI and while I was a young writer, I must tell you I was the union steward of the IBEW. I have always loved unions. I write about them in my book, John Paul the Great. And I forget your question.
Well, let me broaden and get Ed and everybody involved as well. Take, for example, stem cell research, an issue obviously also front and center with Catholic politicians. Confronting an issue such as infertility clinics, where the embryos can either be used for research, according to legislation, or destroyed.
Yeah. And
they opt to use them for research. Or take an issue of Terry Schiavo, where the president and largely Republicans in Congress, with no objections from any Democratic senator, passed legislation in effect saying that the government was going to intervene in that decision.
Yeah.
When 1,000 times a day hospital tubes are removed from people. In fact, the Catholic Church is very interesting in its teaching in terms of using devices for extraordinary continuation, extraordinary devices of life. Those are issues that people wrestle with as well in terms of this lesser of evils. Is it better to take advantage of these embryos, the fact that they're there for research or not? Is it better for families with counseling and their own religious values to decide the fate of their loved ones along with their doctors? How do you wrestle with this as a Catholic, particularly a Catholic politician, making policy that affects 300 million people?
Well, I can't speak as a politician, but I'm a Catholic human, and I would tell you where I start on these issues. Start with trying to promote and to love and to respect and advance living and life, okay? You sort of start with first, do no harm. You start with what's going to help people, from very, very young people to older people, be alive. So to me, that's just sort of where you start off. I had another point that I was going to make, and it just left my head. And I can either spin for about 30 seconds hoping that it comes to me, or I can let Ed, who looks like he has something intelligent to say, go. But pass it back when I give you this sign, okay? Because that'll mean that my thought came to me. Oh, my thought came to me. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry, I'm at that age. All right, let me leave you with something Ronald Reagan
She looks so much
said.
younger than I do, you know. It's scary.
Let me leave you with something Ronald Reagan said. E.J. referenced the fact that Reagan in 1969 or 1970 signed as governor of California the most liberal abortion law in the history of that state. He did it after thinking about it and deciding one way. He thought another decade and decided another way, and he called that one of the worst mistakes he'd ever made. But he had started out with a Westerner's libertarian view towards abortion and wound up with something very different from that. Fine. We all evolve and we all move on and we all hopefully continue to think deeper and deeper and deeper. But Reagan once said to me something that I just thought was so smart, and it's a small phrase, I guess, that I start out with when I think about these huge life and death issues that we're talking about. Reagan said about late 70s, early 80s, he said, when he was discussing abortion, he said, in those days everybody was discussing when life begins, at what point is a fetus viable, at what point is it quickening and turning into a human. 20 years ago we were all talking about that stuff. Well, Reagan didn't know the answer to it, but he said, while we're all debating this and trying to figure it out and trying to think of it scientifically and spiritually in all those ways, he said, maybe while we're thinking about it, we should just think to ourselves, well, what if that abortion were a bag of something on the lawn, just a bag of water on the lawn? He said, if somebody told you that's a human being and somebody else said it's not a human being, you might not know what it is, but you wouldn't kick it. Do you know what I mean? You wouldn't just give it a kick to see if it yells. You'd sort of think, okay, maybe it is, maybe it's not, but you would do no harm. I always thought in its own homely, rather crude way, it wasn't as crude when he said it, it got cruder with me, but I always thought that in its homely, crude way, there was a lot of common sense to that. Thank you.
Go ahead.
First of all, in terms of the church's position on condoms and AIDS is just silly. It's ridiculous. No, it is. I can understand that. I understand. I'm queasy. Abortion is a difficult thing. I understand it's hard choices. There are human beings involved. Church's position on birth control and marriage is ridiculous. Church says, masturbation is a sin. All for that, raise your hand. That's not.
Flash? Why are you laughing?
I think it's the sin of owning. But there's no. Catholics understand that. All right? Catholics are not tortured about. Except for Rick Santorum, who says we ought to outlaw birth control.
Wait, James.
But let me make a point. Catholics are not. We don't feel queasy about birth control pills. We do feel. We understand that abortion is a difficult thing. It's not the same thing. And I think that sometimes I get the view, and have had it for a long time, that they're more interested in following some legalistic thing than understanding what the world is. But I think the average Catholics, vast majority of Catholics understand the difference. And they don't look at a birth control pill as some instrument of sin. And I think it's important, we talk about people sling around the terms cafeteria Catholics. Well, they got so much, you can everybody in some way or another takes what they want. I'm saying the main thing we should take from all of this, and I think that Jesus beat us over the head with it. He wasn't very subtle about it. The real thing is how we treat each other. And that's really what it's about. But I'm not in any way, some of these things are just strike me as being ridiculous. Some of them strike me as being difficult. Birth control is ridiculous. Abortion is difficult for a lot of people, myself included.
Ed Gillespie, let me read you a quote from Henry Hyde, a congressman, Republican of Illinois. He wrote in America magazine in February of '03. And he writes, "Let me describe this bluntly. Catholic legislators who vote to maintain the current regime of abortion on demand in the United States, or vote to legalize euthanasia, or vote to authorize medical research on human embryos, are in a position morally identical to that of Catholic legislators who resisted desegregation in the 50s and 60s. Period. The political shelter of I am personally opposed, but I cannot impose my views on a pluralistic society has collapsed of its own moral incoherence and of its own incompatibility with core American values. Do you agree with that?
Largely I do. Henry Hyde is at the forefront, obviously, of, I think, crafting and making the case that the pro-life point of view is the modern-day civil rights movement and is a civil rights movement, respect for all life. And I know James in his book noted that one of the reasons he became a Democrat was the Democratic Party's leading role in desegregation and in equality issues. I admire him for that. I think that Henry Hyde is someone who has helped to frame this debate, I think, in a very positive manner, in a very forceful manner, and deserves a great deal of respect for that. I do think that, to James's point, I want to go back to Cardinal Carville's comments about the faith. When he starts his breakaway church, I might want to go there. But you know, when you talk about, well, 70% of Catholics don't agree with the Pope on this. I remember when John Paul the Great, his last trip to America, the media had almost a frenzy about how the Catholic Church's positions on different issues, some of which you raised, James, compared to public opinion, and showed that he was at odds with public opinion, as though somehow when he saw the poll numbers he would change his position on these things and yes, get right with the majority of Americans. And the fact is this is a religion, it's theology, and people did some shout outs earlier, I didn't. I should acknowledge my cousin Michael Greco, who will be ordained in June as a priest, and he and I don't necessarily agree on everything either, but he's studying theology and canon law, not public opinion polling. That's what I studied. And he shouldn't be. The fact is that these are, the faith should lay down some areas where they say this is right and this is wrong. We'll all try and negotiate it as best we can, but that's the role of a church, in my estimation, and the role of a religion, to tell us right from wrong.
You know what? But again, it can be, but I don't think it's wrong. I don't think a birth control pill is wrong. I don't. The church can tell me 1,000,000 times. And you know what? I don't think that that a doctor working on stem cell research is the equivalent of Bull Connor. I don't believe it. I don't care what Henry Hyde says till he's blue in the face. I don't care what any of them say. I'm telling you, I don't believe that a doctor trying to cure diseases is the moral equivalent of the Ku Klux Klan. I don't believe it now. I'm not going to believe it tomorrow.
James, that is not what he said. First of all, that is not what he said. Don't distort the man's words. Read him again, Tim. That is not what he said. Is that there is a moral element to the case that's made, and he's right about that. There's clearly a moral element. Just there was a moral element to the case to be made against segregation.
Let me just keep pursuing this because it's important. Ed, as a Catholic layman in America, are you comfortable with a Catholic bishop saying to their parishioners, if you vote for a candidate who is pro-abortion rights, you risk being denied Holy Communion? Or a bishop saying to a Catholic politician, like John Kerry was told by 2 bishops in 2004, you should be denied Holy Communion because you have voted for abortion rights. Are you comfortable with that involvement of the hierarchy in American politics?
Personally, I am not. And by the way, neither are 72% of American Catholics. That said, again, this is a discussion and a debate within the church hierarchy. The fact that 72% of American Catholics don't agree with that point of view or with that approach is, I think, probably unlikely to change what the hierarchy does in that regard.
Well, and the vast majority of Catholic bishops also disagreed in their meetings with Cardinal McCarrick. Yes.
That's a good question. Think of this case. If you vote for, a Catholic simply can't vote for John Kerry. Now, go back to the case of Senator Rick Santorum when Arlen Specter had a primary in Pennsylvania. The Arlen Specter is pro-choice. He was opposed in the primary by a guy called Pat Toomey, who was pro-life. Santorum campaigned, who is pro-life, campaigned for Arlen Specter, the pro-choice candidate. Now you have to ask the question, why is it wrong? Why didn't anybody say, I didn't hear a bishop condemning Rick Santorum for supporting the pro-choice Arlen Specter, but then suddenly in 2004 we had bishops condemning a whole bunch of Catholic voters for thinking about voting for John Kerry. Not all bishops, it must be said. There was a great debate among the bishops, but I think what's troublesome about 04 is that the moderate and liberal bishops were far more conflicted than the conservative bishops were. And that the conservative bishops ended up, and some of my Catholic friends blame the press for this, but the press is always easily blamed, and as a Catholic I can say, yes, we're guilty most of the time. But but the fact is that the strongest voices in the church were those bishops saying, no, a Catholic can't vote for Kerry on these grounds. That would mean in an awful lot of countries in the world it would be impossible to vote for any candidate. And I still go back to the question, if it's okay for Rick Santorum, why isn't it okay for Democrats who voted for John Kerry?
Go ahead, Peggy.
Briefly, I'm sorry, just very briefly. I don't remember bishops or cardinals in the 2004 elections threatening condemning voters who were going to vote for
Bishop
John Kerry.
Bishop Chaput had a very, I just read it this morning,
What did
the
he
whole
say?
interview.
He condemned voters who voted for John Kerry?
He said, he didn't say specifically John Kerry, but it was clear as he was talking, John Kerry's name came up, that abortion is a foundational issue. And he said, imagine what would happen if all Catholics refused to vote for a candidate who was as he saw it, pro-abortion. This would create a revolution. So Chaput argued that the stories in the papers exaggerated what he said. So I went back to the transcript he posted on his website, and it's a very strong statement.
Bishop wrote a letter to his parishioners, and he was very clear. He said, if you vote for a candidate solely because that candidate is pro-abortion rights, then you are...
Well, that's in line with Ratzinger. Solely if you vote for someone only because of one issue. Well, look, however I'll look it up on the internet tomorrow. I think half of us will. But it was one bishop or one cardinal out of all of our bishops and all of our cardinals who made such a statement. All right, so think about that. That's number one. Number two, look, when it comes to this communion rail stuff, can a Catholic who is a Democrat who is pro-choice be cut off from communion, which I think you were referring to? First of all, that is a church issue and will not be decided by us. But second of all, that is an extreme practical challenge. I mean, I don't know how you look into somebody's soul and know if they went to confession yesterday and where they stand with Jesus Christ. That's the first thing. Second thing is, let me just say, I think the Catholic Church will seem punitive, merely punitive, if it makes such an issue. I think the Catholic Church, in fact, the Church itself is defensive, nervous, and silent, really, pretty much on the issues that it sometimes insists on, if you will. They don't teach enough, they don't talk enough about it, and yet every now and then someone will come forward and insist that you do it the Church's way. I think the Church ought to do more to explain its way and what's behind it, what its thinking is, and what its moral history and moral reasoning is.
James Carville, in 1962, in your home state of Louisiana, Archbishop Rummel excommunicated 3 Catholics because they disagreed with his views in terms of integrating the Catholic schools of Louisiana and the whole notion of equality of blacks and whites. Do you think that was acceptable?
Well, first of all, it went through it, and Leander Perez was one of them who could have been one of the worst people who ever trod the face of God's green earth. It wasn't like he just up and excommunicated them, and they defied consistently what they were trying to do in New Orleans. I'm not for excommunication of anybody. I don't think. It's my understanding.
We really do want to make him a cardinal, you know.
I'm serious. My understanding is that the only sin for which you can't be forgiven is despair. And I think if anybody ever needed the love of the church, it was Leander Perez. So, I mean, I think Archbishop Rummel was a courageous man, but I'm not for like excommunicating people and telling people like they want to excommunicate some people in St. Louis because somebody's saying mass and it's a different bishop and that kind of stuff. None of that stuff has a great deal of appeal to me.
When
I think the bigger the sinner, the more we ought to want them.
Ed Gillespie, let me
I just want to, just from a purely political perspective, it's worth noting it was the St. Louis Archdiocese is where
and Colorado Springs.
And Colorado Springs. But most pronounced in the media coverage was the St. Louis instance, and it was actually Missouri was one of the most important states with a high proportion of Catholic voters, where President Bush, the numbers dropped between 2000 and 2004. I think there was a strong backlash against that in Missouri. As a matter of fact, that threat of withholding communion to Catholics who didn't support a pro-life position. So I think that translated into the electorate in a very negative manner for whatever
We've
that's
been
worth.
talking about Catholic politicians, their faith in public policy. We now have 5 Catholics on the Supreme Court. Are those 5 all Republicans, appointed by Republican presidents? Do they have the same standards that Catholic legislators are held to? Must they vote to overturn Roe v. Wade in order to be considered both Catholic and public officials?
Well, I've had the great honor of getting to work with both Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito in the preparation for their Supreme Court confirmation hearings.
He was the James Carville of the operation.
And so I actually have some insight into their views on this, and of course they were asked about it in the hearings, and their answer is that their faith is something they would set aside in their application of the law. And I think one of the things that, going to our earlier discussion, EJ, about the role of the courts and their imposing these things without political discourse, both these jurists are jurists who believe that it is not their role on the Supreme Court to impose their personal viewpoint or their personal religious faith on the outcome of cases. It's to interpret and apply the law as written by legislatures and United States Congress and the Constitution. And so the answer to that, Tim, is I don't think that the same standard applies to them as it does to those Catholic legislators who are voting on such bills.
Do you agree with that, EJ?
I'm not sure you can make the distinction, because why should it not be applied? It either applies to both, I think, or it applies to neither. I just want to point out, when Leander Perez was excommunicated, he announced he would form a new church called Presbyterians. But, it's true. What's striking here, it's again seeing my friend Father Brian here. What's striking, and I think it's a sign that our Catholic conversation has narrowed in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, our bishops put out 2 detailed letters. Peggy was talking about how they should sort of deal in first principles and sort of get us as Catholics talking about serious issues. I agree with that. And they put out one letter on economic justice and another letter on war and peace. A lot of Catholics disagreed with them, and a whole group of neoconservative Catholics put out an alternative letter on economics, which itself was very interesting. But it generated a very broad debate in the country and among the Catholic people. And I think the sort of idea of it was, in a deep sense, small d democratic, which is to say that the bishops had these debates, they presented their best judgment. As it happened, I kind of liked both letters, but other people didn't. But that we had this large moral debate within the Catholic Church. And I think we've spent almost all our time here talking, a good part of our time here talking about abortion. Abortion is a serious issue, but I think that when the bishops called us to debate these larger questions, they were doing a service both to us as Catholics and to our country.
Before we go, I would like to ask each of our panelists to take a few minutes and just reflect on how their faith has affected their public life as a political strategist, as a writer, as a thinker. James, how does your Catholic faith and upbringing, how has it influenced the way you've conducted yourself in the public arena?
Well, know, it's hard to know. You're a Catholic and you're many other things. You're a son, you're a parent, you're a brother, you got friends, you got all kinds of things. I do think that, I mean, I was always proud of my church. I went to Catholic school. My family is very religious. I've seen it. I wish that I had. I confess to you, I wish I had. My faith is deep and is committed as my sister's and my brother's faith. I think it's, as opposed to something, I think it's enviable people who have a depth of faith that I've not been able to acquire. But when I've had difficulty, I've gone back and read things, and I have a deep appreciation for a lot of the Catholic tradition. I'm ultimate cafeteria Catholic, confess to that. But I think that there's so many things that the way that we're taught, and I think that the core of it, and what we should try to remember, at least I do, is it's really about how we treat each other. And it really, and Jesus did say, whatever you do for the least of thee, you do for me. And it's not a bad thing to think about as we go through life. And maybe I don't do enough, and maybe I don't have enough faith. But I know this, that if I care about my neighbor and I struggle and I'm a sinner, I know that God loves me, because that was his kind of favorite people. And that's the most comforting thing, that I know I have the love of God in the struggles that I go through.
Ed Gillespie, how has your faith influence affected your public life?
Well, like James, I think that it obviously infuses who I am, and it is a factor in how, as James said, you treat others and how you go about your business. Your word is your bond in politics. That's a fact. And I think the lessons I learned in my faith have helped guide me in that regard. From another perspective, when I was about 12, for some reason committed to memory the prayer of St. Francis. That served me well ever since. God grant me the courage to change the things I can change, the serenity to accept the things I can't change, and the wisdom to know the difference. And that is a good thing to bear in mind when you're working in political campaigns and in politics. From a more day-to-day perspective, the fact is, as I mentioned, talking about, for example, welfare reform, I think that in some ways the voice of the Catholic faith is the voice of the middle of American politics in a lot of ways, and it has helped me as someone who has tried to be an effective communicator in politics to develop and approach how to get a good message out to the voters.
E.J. Dion.
You know, I grew up in a religious family. My parents were very active in the church, and they acted that way. My dad was a dentist who started a free dental clinic for poor kids. He was a Republican. And he used to say that socialized medicine will come in America because we are all too selfish and don't reach out enough to poor people. You know, my mother was a teacher and a librarian. And so, to me, watching their faith animate them in ways that it led them to serve others, and also led them to be good parents to my sister and me. I think being, growing up Catholic makes you a kind of communitarian in some deep sense, and I think that conservatives who are Catholic are more communitarian than most other conservatives, and liberals who are Catholic are more communitarian than most liberals. But I was worried you were going to ask one of these summing up questions, so I brought one of my favorite statements on this, which is from Reinhold Niebuhr, which I like to think about. He said, "Nothing worth doing can be achieved in a lifetime, therefore we must be saved by hope. Nothing is true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Therefore we must be saved by faith, and nothing that we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore we are saved by love." And that's what my faith taught me.
Maggie Noonan.
My father was a poor guy. He was a Brooklyn half an orphan who went on to become a somewhat itinerant furniture salesman. Because he started out like that, what he really had was hope that the next generation of his family would have it better than him, and the next generation after that would have it better than his kids. That's sort of an American attitude with which to go through life, and I think there was a sort of inherent Catholicism in it and conservatism in it, even though he was a liberal Democrat. I think in the Catholic nature, in the nature of Catholics, maybe it's in the teaching of Catholicism, or maybe it's what we teach, that leaves Catholics so often, leaves their souls so often so ardent and so skeptical at the same time. That to me is the big Catholic tug between being ardent about so many things on the one hand and being skeptical on the other. The skeptical part of that formulation has left me doubting, the dreams of government, doubting the trustworthiness of government, doubting that I can put my trust in organized groups of men and women who have power over me. It has left me sort of skeptical about the world getting perfect. I think we can only make it better. To me, that's pretty Catholic. That's all.
I was having a discussion with a Democrat and Republican one time, and they both basically came to the conclusion that the Democrats were emphasizing the Sermon on the Mount, the Republicans were emphasizing the Ten Commandments, and they were trying to find common ground. And I reminded of the story that David Brinkley told me when I first came to television. How do you take everything you learn in the course of a week dealing with complicated, nuanced issues and summarize it 1 hour on a Sunday morning? And Brinkley says you don't. And that's what we tried to do in an hour and a half tonight. It's almost impossible. He said, well, what you do is give people some idea of the issues and pique their interest and hope they'll try to develop and satisfy their curiosity. He said, but always understand the limits of television. Think of it this way, Tim. If Moses came down from the mountaintop today with the 10 Commandments, how would television news in 2006 report that story? And I said, I don't know, David, how? He said, Moses came down from the mountaintop today with the 10 Commandments. Here's Sam Donaldson with the 3 most important. I understand the limits of tonight. But this idea was Father Leahy's, and he presented it to me at a BC football game. And the end result, I think, was an opportunity for this country to look at Boston College on February 27th and say, we have done our very best to examine complicated, difficult, moral issues, and we did it in a civil way. And there's nothing more important in terms of our church and our experience. But all the niceties are left behind tomorrow night when the Demon Deacons come in this room. Go Eagles! Tim Muldoon.
Nice flourish. I like that. A final note before you leave. The documents, the texts that our panelists spoke about this evening can be found on the Church in the 21st Century website, bc.edu/church21. Thank you all for being here. Thank you again to our panelists.